message today is the 27th message in our Red Letter series, and we've got a ways to go. Today's passage, Mark 5:21-43, is at least two stories in one. Both the stories are very familiar, and I believe they're connected to each other by two words. The title of my message, Talitha Koum. No, those words aren't in English, but we'll get to their meaning as we go along. These stories are very important to us for a few reasons. Number one, they show us what Jesus is like, and they give us insights into his power as well as his love, his grace, and his mercy. From the human side, from our side, what we need to see is these stories show us people who acted in outstanding faith. Oh, they may have been pushed there by hard times, but they also trusted God in the face of daunting circumstances. And they saw their faith rewarded in amazing ways. If you've ever had a hard time, this message is for you. If you've ever been in a position where things look pretty hopeless, this message is for you. If your faith just needs a boost, this message is for you. So let's go to our text, Mark 5, verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Remember, Jesus and the disciples sailed across the Sea of Galilee to get away from the crowds to minister someplace else where God was leading. And as soon as they got there, they found this guy who we call the demoniac. And after Jesus saved that man, the people of the area we call the Decapolis, the 10 cities, asked Jesus to leave. So they went back across the Sea of Galilee. And they ended up in the region of Galilee near the city of Capernaum. When they got there, they were immediately surrounded by large crowds. And it seems like the crowds were really pressing in on him. I really want us to get a handle on this, so I want you to picture in your mind those times when you've seen shots on TV, maybe, of security trying to get a celebrity through a crowd. The people in the crowd are reaching out, they're trying to touch him. They're shouting his name. The people just want to be around this person. But in the process of their desire to be around this person, they're actually keeping the person from doing what he wants to do or what he came to do. In this scenario, Jesus would be the celebrity. The disciples most likely are serving sort of as security. And if you can picture that scenario, you have a good idea what Jesus was going through as we go into this passage. Go to verse 22. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. So here we meet Jairus. He's a leader in the local synagogue. This was, as I understand it, an elected position. His jobs included supervising worship, running the weekly school, and caring for the building. A lot of these guys had close ties to the Pharisees. You almost had to hold that position. And if you were a synagogue leader and fell out of favor with the Pharisees, you probably didn't have your position very long. Of course, by now, Jesus and most of the Pharisees were not seeing eye to eye, and that's putting it mildly. Many Pharisees were actively opposing Jesus. So when we see Jairus kneeling before Jesus, this is a bold move, and it's also a desperate one. Look at verse 23. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter's dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. You can feel Jairus' pain, right? We're not told how Jairus felt about Jesus before this moment, but in the face of a dying child, all of that would fade away. We can imagine him thinking, this man Jesus has helped others and healed others. Maybe he can save my little girl. Now let's not separate this event from what's happening all around Jesus. This is not an isolated incident. Jairus has probably had to fight his way through the crowd. The disciples may have even tried to keep him back because they had someplace that they wanted to get Jesus to. This had to look like an interruption in Jesus' day. But please note, that doesn't appear to be how Jesus saw it. Jesus got Jairus' request, and he went with him immediately. That challenged me a little bit. It really did. It challenged me. How often do I put things off because I'm busy? Now, I'm fully aware of the tyranny of the urgent. Everyone has something that is priority one, and if you try to do everyone else's priority one, you end up pleasing no one. I know people can fill every minute of your time if you let them. But sometimes we need to make time in the midst of busyness. Now again, Jesus had something that we don't. If we read this from a human perspective, it looks like Jesus threw his plan out the window and went. Look, Jesus saw this coming. Jesus knew this was coming. And he knew the end result. He knew this would one day be in Scripture. And on some level, I believe Jesus knew that I would be preaching this on this day and put it out to the internet for the world to see. And his intent in that moment just may have been that you would hear this message and that it would speak to your heart. See, Jesus knows what we don't. He really does. So when we're feeling pressed, we can't just say yes to everything. That doesn't work. But neither should it be an automatic no. Instead, we need to pray and follow the leading of the Spirit. So Jesus hears Jairus' request and he went with him. The rest of the verse reminds us a large crowd followed and pressed around him. And in this moment, we're led into the second story. Verse 25. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Now, I know a number of you have struggled with chronic illness. If that's you, consider this story. This woman has been struggling with bleeding for 12 years. Imagine how weak she must have been. She was very likely anemic. The next verses tell us she was in intense pain. But those are just the things that we can relate to from a 21st century perspective. She is not a 21st century woman. She is a first century Jewish woman who is still living under Levitical law. And this creates a whole other set of problems. Leviticus 15:25. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during her monthly period. And anything she sits on will be unclean, as during her period. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Last time I preached this message, I just called the whole message unclean, because that's what she was according to the law. She was essentially untouchable. If she had a husband, he couldn't touch her, at least if he wanted to go to the temple. If she was married and she had no children to this point, this condition would have kept her from conceiving. And to be childless in that era was seen as being cursed. Because of her bleeding, she would not have been allowed in the temple, and neither would anyone who so much as touched her, even accidentally. She would have been separated from God's people. And this went on for 12 years. The next verses give us more. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. She spent all she had to live on. She gave all she had to doctors, and she just kept getting worse. Her life was terribly hard, and she had to feel almost hopeless. That is, until hope came to town. Verse 27. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. In case you miss it, that right there is faith. She knew one touch of Jesus and she would be healed. And so she touched him. Verse 29, immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Can you imagine? She was healed in an instant. Her life was changed in an instant. 12 years of pain and suffering and separation was gone. Healed with one touch of the hem of his garment. One touch. And she did it quietly so that no one would know. But someone knew. Verse 30. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Now remember, this was done in secret. In the midst of the crowd crushing in on him on every side. How could he have known? And the disciples seemed to think Jesus was just being ridiculous. "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" See, they didn't get it. 1,000 people could have touched him that day, but that was incidental contact. Those touches probably were unnoticed. But this touch was an act of faith. And that faith brought about healing power. Power they both felt. He felt it going out, she felt it coming in. In that one moment, with that one touch, she knew she had been healed. Her long ordeal was over. But Jesus knew his power went out from him. He seems to have ignored the disciples' sarcastic question. Jesus was looking for the person who had been healed. Verse 32 says, "But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it." Now I want you to imagine what this woman is feeling in this moment. She has just been healed. She somehow knew touching Jesus would heal her. There was a reason, though, that she snuck that touch in, hoping that no one would know. She was untouchable. Anyone who touched her was unclean. And so was anyone she touched. And she just touched someone who was so powerful that he could heal a 12-year ailment with a touch. Now, she knew who Jesus was. And she had the faith that he had the power to heal. But she didn't know him personally. If he was like some of the other religious leaders in his attitude, what would someone with all that power do to someone who dared to touch him and make him unclean? She was terrified. He knows. What will he do to me? Look at verse 33. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. There is something so beautiful here. She could have tried to run. She could have tried to hide. But she has felt his power, and now she will trust in his mercy. Her trust was rewarded. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Jesus didn't look for her because he was angry with her. He looked for her to make sure she didn't miss the point. She was healed because she had touched his garment. But this is, as far as I can tell, the second year of his 3-year ministry. There will come a time when the physical touch of his garment will be an impossibility. But it was her faith that brought the cure, not the touch. And she didn't just have the faith, she acted on it. Think about it. She had been ill for 12 years, untouchable, separated from everyone. Her identity to all those around her could be summed up in one word: unclean. Even we only know her because of her ailment. We don't know her name. She was the woman with the issue of blood. But Jesus had given her a new name, a new identity: daughter. She was restored. She was redeemed. She was healed. She was forgiven. She was a child of God. Friend, if you are in need of his touch today, don't run from him and don't try to hide. Our problems don't keep us from God, and he's always there for you. So you go and you touch the hem of his garment in prayer. You go to him by faith and trust him to do the right thing at the right time, knowing if you were in Christ, he has already secured for you the ultimate healing, and in the meantime, he will walk with you through your journey. Now, while all this was going on, remember, Jesus was still surrounded by the crowd. They're still pressing in, and he was still trying to get somewhere, trying to get to Jairus' house. Look at verse 35. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Now, a lot of you know this story, but pretend you don't for just a second. Put yourself in Jairus' shoes. With that one message from home, all hope was gone, right? No, hope was standing right by his side. Verse 36 says, overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, don't be afraid. Just believe. Guys, this is true for us all. We need to put our focus in the right place. Where there is Jesus, there is hope. And Jesus is everywhere and forever. And in Jesus, death, even death, is not the end. And hope of eternity lies beyond. Now, in this story, Jesus knows exactly what he will do. He knows the end result, and I got to tell you, it is going to be mind-blowing. But friend, because of what Jesus did on the cross, a new resurrection is coming, and one that will last forever. So in the midst of any struggle, I echo the words of Jesus, don't be afraid, just believe. Verse 37, he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. This is really interesting. At this point, Jesus broke away from the crowd. This was not something he wanted the crowd to see. He didn't even take all the disciples with him. Just his inner circle, Peter, James, and John. Maybe he left the rest of the disciples to deal with the crowd. I don't know. And there are surely many reasons why Jesus did this. One that occurs to me is that he would only have people in that room who would believe in his power to do the miracle he was about to do. Verse 38. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. I need to spend a little time here. Now, of course, there would be people crying over the death of a child. This little girl was 12 years old. In their culture, that meant that she was in her last year of childhood. Her full potential was before her, but now she was dead. But there's something more that I learned about that culture. Loud weeping and wailing was something that was customary when someone died. If there was no weeping and wailing, it was seen as a sign of disrespect. It was a disgrace. This was so important in that culture that the people of Israel actually had people who were professional mourners. They could pay them to come and weep and wail over a person who died. It was like a job. If you could cry on cue and you could make a scene, you had a career as a professional mourner. That was a thing. Why do I spend time on that? Because of what happened next, verse 39. He went in and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. Now, when Jesus said the child was asleep, that does not mean the child was not dead. She was dead. But because Jesus was there, death was temporary. As if she was asleep and Jesus was about to go and wake her up. And what's really important for us to see is that first part of verse 40. They laughed at him. All the times I read this, I just figured they were disrespecting Jesus once again. But I think there's something more. I think they are witnesses to the death. Think about who these people are. Jairus is a synagogue leader. So most likely, some of these people were professional mourners. They knew the difference between dead and asleep. They had seen their share of death. Death was how they made a living. This girl was dead. Not sleeping, dead. Dead as a doornail, dead. Why is that important? Well, because people like to try to discount Jesus' power over death. I mean, there are people who believe the swoon theory about Jesus. They say Jesus wasn't really resurrected. He just swooned on the cross. In other words, he just passed out. And later he woke up and walked away. Now, there are multiple problems with that theory, of course. Like the fact that he was beaten to within an inch of his life before he was even put on the cross. Or the fact that the Roman soldiers who crucified him would have paid with their lives if Jesus had survived it. That, from a human perspective, is why they put the spear in his side. They pierced his heart to make sure he was completely and utterly dead. And then there's the most convincing proof of all, at least to me. All the disciples but one, and Judas, were martyred. Most of them in pretty hideous, torturous ways. And yet not one of them recanted. There is no way that all of them went to the kind of deaths they went to for a lie. This story shows Jesus has power over death. And those laughing mourners were witnesses to all that had happened. Their hostile testimony should help us all to believe. Look at verse 40, the rest of verse 40. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, Peter, James, and John, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha Koum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Verse 42, immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. Talitha Koum. It's an Aramaic word, Aramaic being the language that Jesus spoke most of his life. It means, little girl, I say to you, get up. And when Jesus spoke it, she got up. The voice that spoke the universe into existence, the one who breathed his life into humanity, spoke and called her back from death. And with those words, a life began. If you think about it, that's the second time that happened that day. The woman who touched the hem of his garment fell at his feet in utter fear, thinking she might be destroyed by the powerful one before her. But instead, he called her daughter. Where seconds ago she was trembling at his feet, fearing for her life, a life that had just been restored, now she was made whole by her faith and by her Father. Standing strong and grateful. Talitha Koum. Little girl, get up. This is one of those times in the Bible where I really wish I could have been standing there, folks. I mean, to see this little girl raised from the dead, that was one thing. But I'd really like to see the laughing mourners when she walked out of the room alive. Oh, that would have been a sight to behold, folks. The passage ends this way. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Why would he have told them, don't let anyone know? Most likely, it was because it was not yet time for the confrontation with the Pharisees that was coming. When Jesus raised Lazarus later on in his life, he left many see the miracle. And the result was the Pharisees found out about it, and they plotted to kill Lazarus too, because many were coming to believe because of that miracle. And there's one last thing. Jesus told them to give her something to eat. This reminds me of that time right after Jesus was resurrected, when the disciples thought he was a ghost. And so he asked for food to show them he was not a ghost, but he was solid, he was real, he was resurrected. Or maybe it was because death can really just take it out of you. I don't know. What I do know is this. We serve a God who has the power over life and death, and even death is not the end for the believer. We serve a God who cares about our every struggle and walks with us through every trial. And we can come to him by faith and in every situation, knowing that he will do the very best that he can do. And nothing is impossible for him. And we know that we are secure in him for this life and beyond. So place your faith and trust in the one who said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. John 11:25 and 26. And the question for all of us is the same one Jesus asked right after he gave us that famous passage, when he said, do you believe this? He is risen, and through faith in him, so shall we rise. He has a power over everything, even death. Have no fear. Walk by faith. Amen.